Hello, good morning everyone. Can I have your cooperation to fill up the front room first before we begin the session? Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very pleasant morning to Yang Berbahagia Academician Dato' Dr. Ahmad Zaidi bin Laidin, Senior Fellow of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, Dr. Patrick Meyer, United States Embassy Science Fellow, Senior Fellows and Fellows of the Academy, Associates of the Academy, distinguished panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ashraf. Welcome to the Clean Energy Public Lecture and Panel Discussion. I would like to warmly welcome Dr. Patrick Meyer to Kuala Lumpur. Dr. Meyer, we are very glad to have you today and to listen to your public lecture on global trends and analysis on clean energy and how it impacts us as a whole. Energy is at the heart of widespread social, economic, and also climate problems. In this context, there is no doubt that renewable energy sources constitute a key element of a sustainable future. Clean energy technologies are vital to alleviate poverty, expanding rural development, and protecting health while promoting sustainable and environmental quality. So quoting President Obama, ladies and gentlemen, he mentioned that the nation that leads the clean energy economy will be the nation that leads the global economy. As for Malaysia, we have 6 more years to achieve our Vision 2020. and I think it is timely that we look into the clean energy economy. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Yang Berbahagia Academician Datuk Dr. Ahmad Zaidi Laidin to give his welcome remarks and continue with introducing our invited speaker for today. Ladies and gentlemen, Datuk Ahmad Zaidi.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Saudara pengacara majlis, Dr. Patrick Meyer, the United States Embassy Science Fellow, senior fellows and associates of the Academy, distinguished panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning. On behalf of the Academy of Sciences of Malaysia, it is indeed a pleasure for me to greet you on a rather interesting occasion. When I first saw Dr. Patrick Meyer, my comment was, "You look like a PhD student, not even a graduate, let alone a fellow of the embassy." But of course, after having small talks with him, I realized that his youthful facade hides a lot of experience behind him. He had actually had something like 10 years in the field, and he had been on Capitol Hill. Where else would you be if you want to talk about policies? And at the same time, he had been involved very much in the topic that we are talking about, the global trends and analysis on clean energy and how it impacts on you. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been said that we are in a rather interesting era. The MC did mention just now that we are talking about the impact of social and economic growth where energy is concerned. But I look upon energy much more beyond that, not just social and economic, but also political and geopolitical, as well as the whole civilization itself. Because as we can see from history, the rise and fall of civilization has many causes, but not least among them is actually the way we manage resources, the way civilizations manage resources. And one of those very important resources is energy. Ladies and gentlemen, we find that if you were, and have been, I'm sure, many of you have been to Europe and the United States, it is not commonplace to see wind turbines on the hills, and if you go through riding a train in Germany, you will see photovoltaic cells on roofs. And if you are lucky enough to be with one of our panelists here who believes in the potential of ocean energy, I think you will see therefore there's such a huge potential of alternative sources. But the question is, do we really understand the sciences and the art of getting at this source of energy? And with the will, the political, intellectual, and social will to actually put some of these ideas into action. I feel that these global trends are very interesting because when people talk about electric cars, it is not really new. I've seen some of the advertisements on electric cars, 30, 40 years ago? And I saw now some of the newer Japanese cars, I will not name the brand, even advertise and say this is fully electric cars already available on the market. But yet, it took quite a long time for this concept of electric car to become reality. In fact, something that is acceptable to the market. So these global trends, what is it that made it change? Well, as I said earlier, it is my understanding that the geopolitics of energy has a lot to do with it. The dependence at one stage of what perceives the dependence of perhaps the most powerful nation on earth, the United States of America, had to depend on the Middle East for energy, changed because they now see that there are other potentials. And I think once the President of the United States makes a commitment, things begin to happen. In my lifetime, I could remember, not many of you can, I'm sure, John F. Kennedy made an announcement. Within the decade, we shall put a man on the moon. I couldn't believe my ears. I liked it. He was very trendy, he was very good looking, it was everybody's dream about what the president should be, young, vibrant, intellectual. But was he speaking science? Was he speaking nonsense? Was he just expressing a wish? And yet, what we saw, that particular vision was achieved. So in the same light, when President Barack Obama says, okay, we're going to go green, I've told myself, yes, things are going to change at last. We will see the realization of the electric cars. We will see the realization of some reduction in carbon dioxide. We will see the implementation of some of these things. Will we? Well, I think this is what Dr. Patrick Meyer has to say to us today. I'm hoping, I'm wishing. Unfortunately, there's always a gap between your wish and the reality. And nevertheless, one thing for sure, all of us will have to face the impact in one form or another. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would just like to say a few words about our guest speaker today. Dr. Patrick Meyer is currently on a 3-month mission in Malaysia as a United States Embassy Science Fellow, stationed at our American Embassy Kuala Lumpur, and assisting the Malaysian Green Technology Corporation, or Green Tech, on developing Malaysian Green Technology or Green Development Strategy. Now in Washington, D.C., Dr. Meyer was involved in the energy efficiency and conservation advisor at the United States Department of State Bureau of Energy Resources, where he furthers the U.S. government's policy to facilitate clean, smart, and secure energy systems abroad as well. Anyway, I do not dare to go further on this. Let the man speak for himself. Ladies and gentlemen, may I invite Dr. Patrick Meyer.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here today and to talk to you all about a number of different things. I'll be speaking a little bit about U.S. domestic trends, which I think are of interest to you, but also be talking about the work that I'm doing here in Malaysia. I'm actually here for 4 months. Originally it was supposed to be 3, but it's been so successful that they've extended me for another month, so I'll be here through May actually. So the title of my talk is Global Trends and Analysis on Clean Energy and How It Impacts You. And that's really what I'd like to hone in on, is how it can actually have an impact on everybody. This is not just a political issue, it's not just an economic issue, but because it is political and economic, it has an impact on everybody today. So I'm actually going to start, see if I can have anybody in the audience that can answer some questions for me. I'm curious, does anybody know what energy source is used the most in Malaysia? Surely there must be something. Malaysia's natural gas reserves will only last about 40 years at the current rate of consumption. So the second question, where's the world's largest solar panel manufacturing facility? Does anybody know?
Supposed to be China, but I think
You're China a lot. Well, you guys should definitely know that it's in. First Solar is an American solar manufacturing facility. And you have a plant in Malaysia. But also very important to point out, all of these panels are exported. 100% are exported. There are none sold into the Malaysian market. I can get into the details of that next week. So, what is Malaysia's most abundant energy resource?
sunlight, solar, sunlight.
It's a trick question. I'm going to say energy efficiency. I really thought I was going to say sunlight. And I'll get into the details of what I mean by energy efficiency as an energy resource. And this is the last question, and you might be wondering where I'm going with this, but how many branches does the U.S. government have?
Too many.
I heard it right away from somebody. Somebody said 3. Yes. Yeah, only 3. And so that's actually where I'm going to start today's presentation, is talking about the 3 branches, maybe a little bit more understanding of where I'm coming from. I know this is social science 101 here, but there's 3 branches of government. We have our legislative branch, which makes laws headed by the Capitol building, and of course Congress. The judicial branch interprets laws headed by the Supreme Court. The executive branch implements laws headed by the White House and the President. I work in the executive branch, but of course it's not just the White House. The executive branch is made up of a number of different agencies, from the Department of Transportation, our Treasury, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, relatively new Department of Homeland Security, and of course the Department of State, which is where I'm working. In most countries, the Department of State would be referred to as the Foreign Affairs Ministry. One other point I'd like to point out is that the U.S. government is not just a bunch of people in Washington, D.C. Actually, the U.S. government employs more than 3 million Americans. If we were compared to any other employer, private sector or public, it is the world's largest employer. But there's actually more people as a percent of population working in places like Colorado Springs or Virginia Beach, Virginia, Honolulu, Hawaii. There are actually more government workers in those cities than there are in Washington, D.C. So we're spread out all over the country, of course. I work in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Department of State. This is responsible for international relations of the United States. It's actually the oldest U.S. government agency, formed in 1789. We employ about 50,000 people. It's about 11,000 foreign service, 7,000 civil service. But interestingly, I think that's 31,000 foreign nationals. That means that the Department of State actually employs more foreign citizens than it does U.S. citizens. Our budget is $56 billion, which at first glance might seem like a lot of money, but if you compare it to the Department of Defense, which has an annual budget of $660 billion, and our total annual budget of $1.3 trillion, then $56 billion is actually not that much money by relation. So we work on all types of issues, of course, everything across the board that you could ever imagine. Climate change and energy, as I'm talking about here, but of course, counterterrorism, non-proliferation, privacy, trafficking, youth issues. We have programs that are tackled in every single aspect that you could really ever imagine. And the U.S. Department of State also oversees all of our embassies and consulates worldwide. The first mission was established in Paris, and then now we have 285 embassies and consulates. So in a relatively small country like Malaysia, we just have an embassy in Kuala Lumpur, but in a very large country like China, for example, we have not only an embassy in Beijing, but I believe 3 or 4 consulates spread out throughout the country, mostly to make it easier for people to apply for visas, so they don't have to go all the way to Beijing to get a visa. So I'm here in Malaysia as an embassy science fellow. And so this is a program that was created in 2001 by the Department of State, by USAID, which is our development agency, and the National Science Foundation, which you all might be familiar with. And so this is a special program that takes U.S. Government employees with a scientific background and puts us in U.S. embassies for a period of 2 to 4 months. And so in the last 12 years, 13 years, there's been about 200 scientists from 12 different agencies. And this is actually, I think it demonstrates a heightened interest in Malaysia scientific cooperation, because I'm the second fellow to be here, and we already have a third fellow in the works, but Dr. Sonia Ortega, she was the first fellow, she was here about a year ago, and working mostly with minds on science education issues. And then if we get the fellow that we want for the third fellow, he will arrive in late 2014, and he's going to be focusing on health and cancer research. So it will likely be somebody that the Academy of Sciences here will interact with. Okay, so I'm going to broaden out a little bit and talk about some global energy and emissions trends. This is a very famous picture. Many of you have probably seen this. It's used in a lot of presentations. Of course, this was taken by NASA a number of years ago, and shows the world at night. I'm going to show you what I like, a different version of this picture. And so this is the same image that's been contorted in proportion to population distribution. So you can see places like Asia, Africa, especially China, India, where the most people live. Also, though, that's where you see large areas of darkness on this map, as opposed to the United States or Western Europe, for example, which have relatively small populations but are pretty heavily illuminated. And this actually corresponds really well with the numbers that we get from the United Nations and the World Bank that show that the number of people without access to electricity, there's 700 million people in Asia, and there's 600 million people in Africa without access to electricity. Also in Latin America, 30 million, and in the Middle East, it's about 20 million people. So in total, there's actually 1.3 billion people around the world who do not have access to modern electricity services. So this is changing, though, as more and more people live in cities, as countries become more urbanized. So on this graph here, you see different levels of urbanization over time. And so the United States and Western Europe, for example, have been mostly urbanized for a long period of time, and Brazil more recently. China, this is a really critical point right here in 2010 to 2011, where they became 50% urbanized for the first time. So more people living in cities than in rural populations. Southeast Asia is a little bit lower, and India, of course, may not be 50% urbanized for as many as another 20 to 30 years. But what's really important, actually, in this context, is that Malaysia is an outlier to most of your neighboring countries. Malaysia, in about 2010-11, was already 70% urbanized. So you're actually a little bit closer to the trends that we would see in Western Europe and the United States than you are to many of your neighboring countries. And so if you look at this from a whole global perspective, 2010 was actually a really important year, because it was the very first time that there are more people living in cities than there are in rural populations. And as the population continues to grow, this is a trend that will absolutely continue for the foreseeable future. So there's now 400 cities with more than 1 million people. And of course, people move to cities for many different reasons that you can imagine. There's better jobs, better services, financial opportunities, education. There's plenty of reasons why people will continue to move to cities. The impact that this has on the energy supply, of course, is that more and more people are using modern appliances and contraptions that consume energy. So energy for the foreseeable future will continue to increase in supply and demand. So here we have an evolution of the global energy supply with projections to 2030. And what you can see is that global energy supply and demand is likely to grow by about 40% between now and 2030. And what that means is that coal will most likely decline, oil will stabilize fairly, natural gas, nuclear, and renewables will likely increase over that period. And this graph shows a pretty ambitious amount of renewable energy coming up for here. And Malaysia is no different, actually. If you look at the Malaysian trends, it lines up quite well with the global trends. By 2035, primary energy supply will increase about 50%. That's right about on track with many of the global averages. And where most of that will be coming from is from natural gas, which is the light blue here, and oil will kind of stabilize between 2020 and 2035. Of course, these are projections and they're up for debate. Of course, it's only as good as the data that we have available today. But I think that the main point, and probably undeniable, is that natural gas will continue to expand in Malaysia. Of course, renewable energy, which is the green up top, will also play a major role, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. So that was primary energy supply. But if we just look at electricity, we see a similar trend, but it also tells a little bit of a different story. This is the world electricity mix with projections through 2040. And what's important is that the amount of oil that's used for electricity consumption is going to be phased out essentially throughout this century. A lot of gas expansion and coal will kind of levelize as well. We see a lot of nuclear and a lot of renewable energy coming on board the grid. And so where is that actually going? Here's a breakdown between the different sectors. And you can see that industrial is about a 50-50 mix with residential and commercial. It's about a half. But transportation, which I know some of our panelists will be talking more about the transportation industry a little bit later, although it's this tiny little slice up here, if you look really closely, you'll see that the amount of electricity that is consumed for transportation will actually more than double over that period. It's still very small, but a doubling is quite substantial. And again, the Malaysian projections are actually kind of on par with the global projections, but I think that Malaysia actually has a pretty interesting history of their electricity mix. Because if you see throughout most of the 1990s, natural gas really experienced a major renaissance, if you will, within Malaysia, especially as oil was being taken off the grid as an electricity source. Throughout the early 2000s, late 2000s or early 2000s, that did kind of stabilize, and now there's a pretty good mix between coal and gas. The major difference in the future will be that hydropower will increase pretty substantially, and that's really just due to a few large-scale hydro projects that are coming on board in Sarawak. So from a world greenhouse gas emissions standpoint, I know this is kind of a busy graph, but this shows three really important things. So on the leftmost area here, it's where is all the greenhouse gas emissions coming from? This breaks it down, and you can see that energy is the largest component of greenhouse gas emissions by far, mostly from, or almost entirely from coal, natural gas, and oil. And then, of course, there's direct emissions from things like land use change, things like that. So this is where it's all coming from. Here's the second column, which shows where is that, what's driving those emissions. So industry makes up the largest percentage, 29% of those emissions are driven by consumption by industry. And then the next largest is transportation, which also contributes very heavily, of course, to those emissions. And then the third thing that it shows is what actual emissions are coming out of the other end. And you can see that CO2, carbon dioxide, by a considerable degree, makes up the most emissions. And then the smaller ones like CH4 and N2O, I know you can't read that, and I think that's hydrofluorocarbons down at the bottom. They make up a very small percentage, but what's actually really important is that these gases that are down here have a higher global warming potential. So even though there's a smaller percentage of those emissions, a small amount of these gases can actually have a bigger impact on the environment than all of this large amount of CO2 here. So in total, global annual CO2 emissions are about 50,000 million tons per year. And you have to kind of wonder, where is that coming from? This graph here breaks it down by a number of different regions around the world. There's a few important points. Number one is the light blue line right here, which I like to point out, is non-OECD Europe and Eurasia. And right about right here is the fall of the Soviet Union. And you can really see what kind of an impact that economic trend would have on how much energy is being consumed and how many emissions are being used. Of course, the second thing that's really important is China's emissions, which are shockingly high, starting about in 2001 to 2002. They skyrocketed mostly due to putting a lot more coal power onto the grid. And then the third thing to point out is that non-OECD Asia is the fastest growing emitter outside of China. So Malaysia falls into this trend here, and it is an emissions